Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. As we've been focusing on in the last number of podcasts, of course, but it's the Canadian election. That's what's on everybody's minds. And as we record this particular edition, we're about 1 month away from the election. April 28th, of course, is when Canadians will vote, unless, of course, you're going into one of the advanced polls. And the numbers here continue to look good for the Carney Liberals right now with a lead. Don't forget they were down by about 25 points just a few months ago, and now they seem to have increased their lead over the Conservatives. And as we've talked about and predicted, and I think the reality here is, this is a two-party race. The NDP are fizzing and fading, and a lot of that support seems to be bleeding over to the Liberals right now, and they're talking about majority government. Now, again, there's a long way to go before the election itself, and the worst thing that can happen to any political party, whatever your political persuasion, is for people to get complacent and figure, oh, this is over, don't worry about it. Over the years as a broadcaster, and frankly for a number of years when I was in politics at the local level anyway, there's a long list of people I know and interviewed who have fallen victim to that. Like everybody said, oh, you got in the bag, don't worry. I didn't really vote for you because I thought it was going to be easy for you. And bingo, you get talked off to the sidelines. So I know that all the parties right now are convincing the followers or potential followers, you got to follow through on this. You've got to pay attention and you got to vote on election day. It's going to be interesting to see just what those numbers look like. And that's another interesting phenomenon to what's happening here. The conventional wisdom a lot of the time seems to think that, especially when it comes to federal and provincial elections, is the average voter is not really paying attention because they're busy with their lives until about a week, maybe 2 weeks before the election. I think it's different this time because there's so much at stake, and we're all, I think, aware of what's going on and what the challenges are, that we are paying attention. Which is why I think when you see the numbers and the switch in numbers and the support that seems to be flowing right now towards the Liberals, it's because people are paying attention and making their decisions early about who can do what, and their decisions about who can't do what. And we talked about that in the last couple of podcasts about Mark Carney and his qualifications. And I mentioned, I think, at the last time that, what's going to happen now is the strategists, especially the Conservative strategists, are going to look at this and figure out, okay, we got to take this guy down. So there will be a lot of misinformation about that. CSIS and other organizations, of course, actually issued a warning about a week or so ago saying that they have good information that there is going to be a concerted effort to try to smear Mark Carney's reputation by Russian and other entities right now to try to influence the Canadian election. That's based on some of the strategies and some of the intel that they have right now. And we've already seen that happen to a certain extent. We mentioned on the last podcast about the attempt to try to find some people over in the UK that wanted to discredit the work that Carney did with the Bank of England, especially during the Brexit scandal. And we talked about the lack of credibility from some of those quote-unquote critics. Same thing is happening right now. They're trying to make a lot of hay, of course, about Carney's wealth and blind trusts and things of this nature. The reality here is that he's following the rules, as most people do in situations like that. And if anybody has any evidence that he's not following the rules, good, let's have that discussion. But it's not happening that way at all. Notwithstanding that, of course, they're simply saying, well, you should have done it sooner. What about this and what about that? Very little to no indication or discussion about Pierre Poilievre's wealth and what he's doing with that. And as we mentioned in the last podcast, there's a guy who is apparently heavily invested in the oil industry in this country, and nothing wrong with that. But you have to ask yourself, as the guy wants to be the leader of this country, is he going to be making policy decisions based on Canadians' best interests, or is it going to be based on exactly his own portfolio and what could benefit from that? We don't know yet. Because Poilievre is not very forthcoming about this. But there do seem to be some indications that people are not grabbing Poilievre's message. I mean, even now, despite the fact of some of the policy decisions made by Carney about what they're going to be doing in government vis-a-vis carbon tax and things of this nature, Poilievre is still clinging to this, axe the tax, carbon tax Carney and all this sort of stuff. And it's getting a little tiresome. No matter what your political affiliation is, it's a very juvenile campaign that Poilievre seems to be running with. It's all about catchphrases, or in his mind, catchphrases anyway. Rhyming couplets and trying to get his little dig in here. Axe the tax, carbon tax, Connie, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, who writes this stuff for him? Dr. Seuss? I mean, they're so juvenile and it's so ineffective, yet he seems to cling to those. So much so that a lot of the criticism now about his performance so far in this election is coming from conservatives as well. Interesting analysis that came out just a couple of days ago from Corey Tenek. And Corey Tenek is a conservative strategist. He worked for Stephen Harper for a number of years, actually in the Prime Minister's office after Harper was elected, and most recently was the head honcho and the big push behind Doug Ford's re-election here in the province of Ontario. Very successful and well-respected strategist. And he says that, look, the thing here is Poilievre has to learn to pivot and get away, which basically means get your act together. That's, I think, kind talk for that. Even Tenek says that Poilievre still, after all this time and after all this input, still too Trumpy. And Canadians don't like that. They're just not gravitating to that. You have to wonder just, how these guys are going to respond to these sorts of things. And if there is an opportunity for him to pivot, and I'm not sure that there is. Carney, on the other hand, seems to be perceived as a level-headed leader who's got an idea, who's got a game plan, whose expertise is right down the path here of economic stability. This is what the guy did and has done all his career, all his life. So he seems better suited for this job. Tom will tell us certainly what's going to happen come election time. But we'll see how they're going to respond to this and just how Canadians are going to respond to this. But the criticism, and I think is well-founded. We talked about another example about pivoting, and Poilievre seems to be now to try to gravitate to the political base, the hardcore conservative right-wing base, talking again this week about mandatory life sentences for some crimes. Lock them up and throw away the key. Well, that is an essential replication of one of the Stephen Harper policies. Remember his get tough on crime policies from a few years back before this? Same idea, mandatory sentences, and they rammed it through, of course, because they had a majority government. They would put it in an omnibus bill and a whole bunch of other stuff and then pad that stuff in there. We talked about the legitimacy of that way of doing things, that process. But anyway, it did pass, but just about every aspect of this, including mandatory life sentences, was tossed out by the Supreme Court of Canada because they said that's unconstitutional. It's against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Poilievre was in government then. It's sitting on the back bench at that time. I hope he was still paying attention. But basically, the court said you can't do that. Well, now Poilievre's trying to reintroduce that and say this is what we're going to be doing. It just doesn't make sense. He must be playing on the fact that he's thinking Canadians aren't smart enough or they have short memories and they're not going to remember that policy has already been tossed out, and he's going to try to reintroduce it if he becomes the government. You have to wonder about exactly what's going to be happening here. And the pundits, the experts who have been following elections and covering elections for many, many years now, I think are finally starting to look at Poilievre and saying, look, this guy just doesn't seem to measure up. Lawrence Martin, the esteemed author of about 10 books, most of them on politics, and a long-time political columnist with the Globe and Mail, in his recent column this week, he describes Poilievre as an angry teenager in the body of a grown man. Petulant, etc., all the descriptors that seem to fall in with that sort of description. He's just not getting it done. And Canadians, I think, are cluing into this. So back to Corey Tenek's idea that Poilievre has to pivot. I don't know if it's too late to do that. I think people have already made up their minds. And unless there is a monstrous shift in public opinion in the next couple of weeks, these numbers that the Liberals seem to be riding on right now may well propel them to government. We don't know. And again, I'm not going to be making predictions, but it seems pretty clear right now that Canadians are paying attention and they are making their decisions about just who they think is going to be the leader that they need to try to get us out of this economic crisis. And to that end, as we record this particular show, we've got word that we just finished off that the Prime Minister and Donald Trump just finished their first conversation, official conversation. And it was a phone conversation that we're told was basically initiated by the White House, that the White House had reached out to the Prime Minister earlier this week and said, we got to get together and talk about this. Well, that did happen apparently earlier this morning. And Trump has already put something out on Truth Social. And it's rather eye-opening, quite frankly. He refers to the Prime Minister as the Prime Minister. He refers to the country of Canada not as the state or part of the 51st state, et cetera, which is interesting because it seems to fall very much in line with what Prime Minister Carney was talking about. As he said, he will have that conversation about trade issues with the president when the president and the American government starts showing some respect for Canada. Well, based on how Trump has responded and his description of this phone conversation that they had, that respect seems to have been there. Now, we'll see just how far that's going to go, because if we've learned one thing about Donald Trump over the years, is frankly, you can't trust the guy. No matter what he says, even if he's ingratiating in one moment, he can turn the next. I mean, the very reason that we're having these arguments and this discussion these days about trade is because Trump has reneged on his own trade deal. He's described the Canada-U.S. trade situation here with it's COSMA, as we call it on this side of the border, USMCA deal, they call it down there. It's the rejig, of course, NAFTA deal. He's saying it's the worst trade deal that America's ever been involved in, and we're getting ripped off. Forgetting, he's the one that signed it. It was his administration that negotiated these trade deals, and he's the one that described it when he signed it as the greatest trade deal in American history. Now, all of a sudden, he's basically said, I'm not going to comply with that anymore. Non-compliance with a trade deal essentially means that, look, I can't trust this guy. I can't take him at his word. So we always have to have that in the back of our minds as we're talking about Trump and what his responses are going to be and what, if any, commitments he's going to try to make at this stage. It's going to be very difficult to negotiate with a guy that is insincere at worst and basically covert, I guess, even the possible scenario about exactly what he's going to be doing here. I'd be very wary, and I think the Carney administration on this side of the border has to be very wary about just what's going to be happening. Anyway, we'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks about this. Always interesting, though, to keep abreast of exactly what's going to be happening and the reaction to it and how Canadians are going to be responding. But as we've talked about in past, and we continue to do with our podcasts right up until Election Day, and again, I'm not overstating this, I think this is the most important election in this country's history. I know we've had, the idea of Quebec separation, and we've had issues to do with trade deals in the past and on and on, and they were important issues, to be sure. But this is pivotal. This is going to change the direction or reinforce the direction that Canada is going to have going forward for the next many years, not just the next administration, whatever the case might be. So get involved, as we've always said on the podcast. All right? Stay in touch and stay informed. We'll talk to you next time.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wissenz Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wissenz Law, 905-522-1102 or wissenslaw.com.